Not too long ago, Professor Gad Saad, whom I'm sure all of you are familiar with, put out a video debunking the canard of biological determinism. All well and good. Biological determinism is a canard, and I'm going to go into the details of that. But he also spent a lot of time talking about behavioral plasticity, and I'm going to be talking a lot about that as well. Now, I think, and I'm revisiting some of this, but I'll be adding some new material, we have a fundamental problem in describing human phenomena, human behavior. If we get stuck in quote-unquote biological determinism, it's true we're lost. So a lot of people spend time talking about the importance of the environment and the interaction. And yes, absolutely. Evolved human behavior is, at its core, the result of continual interaction between biological faculties, physiology, and an external environment. No one is disputing that. So biological determinism is a canard. It's false. However, bioenvironmental determinism is necessarily true. And why is that? I think instead of using terms such as bio or biological or environmental, if we just stuck with the term determinism, we could navigate the seemingly ethereal field of human behavior a lot better and a lot more skillfully, because we could have an actual discussion on what that means. Now, the basic meaning of determinism is causality. One thing is caused by another. An event is determined by something, and a particular behavioral phenomenon is determined by something as well. I don't think many people are going to dispute that. But let's grant a concession. Let's make a concession here for the sake of argument. It's not true, but let's grant this concession. I believe his name was Skinner, one of the famous behavioralists, the behavioral psychologist from the mid-20th century who thought that everything could be modified vis-a-vis the environment, hence behavioralists. Let's say that were true. That's still a deterministic view, which is to say that biology is not involved, physiology is not involved, mental factors is not involved, but everything comes externally from the outside. That's still a deterministic view of the world. You can't escape determinism. You can't escape something causing something else. And one thing I find fascinating by people who still hang out in that area of the intellectual globe is that that kind of environmental advocacy doesn't grant you any more freedom than someone who advocates for a purely biological descriptive model. I mean, you have to think about it. How much actual autonomy and malleability, and I'll get to the plasticity in a bit, does an individual have concerning his environment, particularly during that very crucial period of time we call childhood, teenagehood? For the most part, we as children and teenagers are at the behest of an environment we do not understand, that we have no control over. We are under, officially and unofficially, the command of parental figures, usually, who belch orders at us, and because we cannot be responsible, we do not have well-developed brains, we usually heed those orders. So we are born into an environment we have no control over. And I know I've used this example before, but it's a good one, so I will use it again. What if Stardust, born to a middle-class New York family, were born with the identical faculties, mind you, identical physiology, mind, everything, to some poor family in some extremely poor area of West Virginia, in, say, a coal mining town? How much different would I be? I would suggest I'd be significantly different. Yet in neither of these circumstances, either the middle-class New Yorker family or the poor West Virginian family, do I, the individual, the child growing up in that environment, have very much control. Which is to say, my autonomy under these conditions is about zero. Now, Gad Saad spends a lot of time talking about this, and he talks about, not specifically this, but sort of behavioral plasticity. And I've seen the word plasticity thrown about, bandied about quite often. I see it bandied about quite often in the realm of neuroplasticity and now behavioral plasticity. And although the word plasticity is not invoked, we hear it smacks of similar tones, such as epigenetics. Now, what do I What do I view this as, in fact? I view this as a kind of attempt to create a get-out-of-jail card, which is to say, on the one hand, you have scientists such as Gad Saad who are trying to describe behavioral universals. He is an evolutionary psychologist / economist. That's what he does. He tries to do that. But no one in academia in particular is comfortable with the idea of fixedness or inability to change things. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a bit as well, immutability versus infinite flexibility. But focusing on what Gad Saad said and some others I've listened to in recent years, this idea of plasticity, I believe, is used and uttered so as to defend the ideas of universals by offering a get-out-of-jail card, which is to say, yeah, there are a lot of things that are universal and can be observed and seem quote-unquote fixed, but human behavior is plastic, that i.e. there's plasticity in human behavior and thus it doesn't necessarily hold true. To me, this sounds like a bunch of rubbish. It's true that human behavior is plastic to some degree, just as there is neural plasticity to some degree. But frankly speaking, there are always limitations. So let me get into the area of immutability versus infinite flexibility. Now, of course, none of these scientists or academics or people proposing degrees of plasticity are talking about a sort of infinite flexibility. But the converse of that, of course, is immutability. Is the human being an immutable creature? Of course not. I don't think anyone really argues that per se. And I don't think many people would argue that human beings are infinitely flexible in what they can be and what they are, although I would imagine many people would favor arguing that over the latter over the former. But there is a strong implication when you start talking about plasticity to suggest that, yes, human beings have so much behavioral plasticity that anything can go, despite the universals we can observe. Getting back to the point before, even if you were to grant complete environmental control over everything, that doesn't grant you one iota of freedom in what you can be. Once again, Stardust grows up in middle-class New York. Stardust grows up in poor West Virginia. You're going to get potentially, probably almost certainly, very different versions of myself. And if multiverse theory is true, then presumably there is a Stardust who grew up in West Virginia. It'd be interesting to see how he turned out. But getting off topic there, I think that academics are still in the business of trying to shield themselves from attacks from people on the left, from people who aren't comfortable with the idea, or rather that the idea doesn't sit well with these kinds of people, that yes, there are things in human behavior that are relatively fixed. And I hate even using the word relatively fixed, because the problem of false dichotomies, whether it's biological determinism or environmental determinism, factually, bioenvironmental determinism is true. But the problem with these false dichotomies is it doesn't allow you very much wriggle room in describing a phenomenon. So, use the term roughly or sort of fixed. It doesn't really tell you much. And one of the problems I find with what Gad Saad says and some other academics I've read, such as in the academic handbook, the handbook of evolutionary psychology, is that, well, yes, human beings are flexible. They have plastic behavior and a relatively plastic neurology. Okay. But when we talk about adaptive change, when we talk about the fundamentals of evolution, animal evolution, and consequently, of course, human evolution, since we're animals as well, how much wriggle room is there? And how long does it take for adaptive change to kick in? Traditionally, it takes quite a long time, millennia, usually. So, although human beings are not immutable, we can change for the purposes of rational discussion and descriptivity. We might as well be talking about fixed states of being. Now, The difference now in talking about these things as opposed to 200 years is that we're very much on the cusp of new technologies, of discovering new things, etc. Gene editing, for example. How much, and we're still far, far away from actually doing anything with this that's relevant, but what these technologies could do, how they could impact human beings, well, it's impossible to say, but they could have a radical impact. We know in, say, the science fiction game Deus Ex, Human Revolution, and the forthcoming Mankind Divided, I mean, there are such things as neural implants. So, indeed, yeah, human behavior could be modulated in that way. But until we're there, we're kind of left with what we have, which is to say, adaptive changes, behavioral plasticity, has a limited range of movement. It is constrained. And I want to talk more about constraints right now. In the linguistic field of syntax, everything is about constraints. In syntax, you study what cannot be said rather than what can be said, and you base your analyses and your observations on what cannot be said rather than what can be said. Another way of putting it is what is ungrammatical and what is grammatical. And based on what is ungrammatical, that's how you arrive at a proper analysis and a proper dissection of how human language works. What do I mean by this? Well, there's a rather famous topic, for example, called WH movement, and it is a vast topic, and there is a veritable encyclopedia of knowledge and published articles and books on the subject. I needn't bore you with the details. You wouldn't understand them anyway. I barely understand them these days because I'm out of the loop. But, for example, why is the sentence that I'm just uttering grammatical, but another version of the sentence grammatical why is not? So a syntactician would study the not so grammatical version of that sentence based on the constraints within English, and then thereby apply them to possibly other languages and ideally to a universality of grammar. So in syntax, you start with the constraints on language, what can be said and what can't be. Why can you can say, for example, who is at the door, but you cannot say the door who is at. Doesn't make any sense. But the question remains, why doesn't it make any sense? What constraints are operative, etc., etc. And then you end up creating all kinds of syntax trees and mapping it out and yada, yada, yada. The point I'm making here is the way you understand syntax, whether it's English or Hungarian or German or Japanese or whatever, or human syntax in general, is you work within the paradigm of constraints and you build your model and your thesis and your theory on what those constraints are rather than on what is possible. It's in a similar fashion. It's why when I made my video Sort of Mating and various other videos, I begin with reproductive constraints as a model for explication of other phenomena, which is to say, what is plausible for the human male, what is plausible for the human female, and what are the limitations imposed on both. And given those limitations, you can get very different outcomes, respectively. So you really, I believe, in science and any sort of descriptive model and understanding phenomena, you need to talk about what the constraints are. When you use the plasticity, the flexible model, you're kind of lost in the ethereal ether of nothingness. Describing human behavior as plastic doesn't really tell you how plastic it is, what's plastic about it, what's flexible about it, and what's not. Whereas if you start with what can be said and what can't be said, as in, say, grammar, what can human beings do, what can they be, and what can they not be, that can tell you a lot more about what they actually are. Because if you've already covered the ground of what they can't be and what they can't do, that's going to tell you a whole lot more information about what they can be and what they can do and how they are and what they are and how they interact with the world. So I actually see the whole plasticity argument as rather poorly defined, even though Gad does offer examples, and I'll be posting a link to that video if you want to check it out. But it just doesn't give you the information you need to understand human beings. What about human beings specifically is plastic? Only if you know what about human beings is not plastic and what they cannot do and what they cannot achieve and what they are not, can you begin to talk about what they are and what they can achieve and what they can do. That's my view of things. And I think it's accurate because you have a basis for explanation. Infinite plasticity, which I'm not saying he's advocating that per se, but that's always the implication made by academics and others, is a get out of jail card, as I said at the beginning, a way of wriggling around certain problems that people don't want to face. Which is to say, for all intents and purposes, we're kind of stuck the way we are at the moment. If genetic editing comes to the fore and is a really powerful force, well, maybe that'll change. And who knows? Maybe we'll experience a Adam Jensen-like moment as Serif Technologies takes over and we all become augments. Who knows? That's all possible, but certainly not in the immediate future, I would say, based on my observations. And if you're involved in this field of research, please enlighten me if I'm wrong on that. But we're more or less stuck with what we are as now. And with regards to MGTOW, a lot of people describe MGTOW as a sort of as a prime example of behavioral plasticity. I guess that really depends on the context. I mean, MGTOW by definition, perhaps not by definition, but almost by definition is dysgenic. It's not helpful in propagating your DNA. And as you know, my position is not that you must propagate your DNA. I don't see it as significant or insignificant, just is something that some people do. But from a reproductive perspective, it's not a particularly useful plastic behavior to avoid marriage and reproduction, if that is seen as a worthwhile goal, which for me, it's not. So plastic, yes, to what degree, poorly defined. So I think my thesis here in this video is simply that instead of using very nebulous and vague and poorly defined words such as plastic and plasticity, we should always begin with the constraints. What can human beings do? What can a human female do? What is her what are her limitations? What are the limitations of a human male? And from that, we can get a lot. I think I proposed some decent information, and I think I hypothesized accurately in assortative mating as a delimitative factor in male ideological choice, what those limitations are as a basis for the formation of certain groups that form their consensus around, say, white identity or what have you. Without constraints, without listing behavioral constraints, reproductive constraints, it's not possible to even understand what's going on there. So I think collectively, whether we're professors or YouTubers or whatever, we need to move away from this sort of the implication of infinite flexibility and more towards what are the constraints on human beings, just like what are the constraints on WH movement? Why is the sentence, where's my friend at? Okay, but my friend where is at not? The same principle. We just apply it to human beings. Anyway, that's all I have to say on that subject matter before I rattle on. More to come, of course. I plan on talking about several other subjects during this week, and I wish you a enterprising Monday, wherever you might be, and an enterprising forthcoming week, the last week of March, in like a lion out like a lamb, as they say. You take care, and as always, may your chosen deity watch over you. Bye-bye.